Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our forum, Why Trees Matter for Green Development. You are hosted this evening by the Trees as a Public Good Network. We are an advocacy group for protecting forests and urban trees in Massachusetts. Our network membership includes individuals and members of other advocacy groups, as well as scientists. I invite you as you join the chat to introduce yourself, where you're from, what organization or Democratic committee you're with, and how you heard about the forum. We're very glad to have you. My name is Melissa Brown. I am a member of the Trees as a Public Good Network. Like many people, I also have other affiliations with the Newton Dems, with Mothers Out Front, and with a local group, Protect Newton Trees. We have been very fortunate to have a large number of co-sponsors, and we're very grateful for their help in getting the publicity out. The slide you see up is acknowledging their generous help. As we go through the program, we will be putting links for action into the chat. And later you will receive an email that will give you a link to the recording and also to those actions that you can take. I hope some of you will consider joining our network as we go forward. At the federal, state, and local levels, trees are finally being recognized for their importance in fighting climate change. So we've organized this evening around two sections, one to talk about forests and the other to talk about urban trees. In each section, we will have a research scientist who will be providing evidence based on scientific research about trees. And then we will also have community advocates who are explaining cases they are familiar with where we need action. In addition, we're very lucky to have messages from two climate champions who are taking legislative steps to help with that. And so we will be doing all of those as well. It's our common practice at the Trees as a Public Good Network to do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings, and so I want to begin with that. We acknowledge that we live on lands loved for millennia before us by Indigenous people, including the Massachusetts, Nauset, Nipmuc, Pawtucket, Pocumtuck, Pokanoket, and Wampanoag tribes and nations. We give thanks to the Indigenous peoples who stewarded the land and waters for so long, and we recognize that wherever we are zooming from in the Commonwealth, we meet this evening on lands taken from Indigenous people, whose descendants still live among us. We endeavor to create a culture that recognizes that we are all part of one earth and one shared ecosystem, and that everyone has a right to healthcare, affordable homes, and clean air and water. We strive to educate ourselves and each other about these complex issues and about our collective power to stop damage to lands, water, air, and life, and to support healthy, sustainable, and diverse renewal. Thank you for coming. If you just got here, let me welcome you to our forum, Why Trees Matter for Green Development, hosted by the Trees as a Public Good Network. My name is Melissa Brown. I'm with the Trees PG Network, as well as the Newton Dems and some other organizations. As you come in, we invite you to introduce yourself, where you come from, what organization or Democratic committee you're with, and how you heard about the forum. Trees as a Public Good is an advocacy network for protecting trees and forests in Massachusetts, and we promote understanding that trees are a public good, not belonging to any single individual. To kick us off in great form, we are so pleased to be able to begin our forum with Senator Ed Markey, who has been a real climate champion for us. The senator is traveling this evening, so we have a recording of him.
Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and a special thanks to the Trees as a Public Good Network for organizing today's webinar on the eve of Earth Day. With the Inflation Reduction Act funding and tax credits that I fought for in Congress, we're making progress on climate. Solar investments outpaced investments in oil for the first time globally last year. More money for solar than for oil. That's the first time it ever happened. But to flip an old saying on its head, we can't lose the trees for the forest. Trees deliver relief from extreme heat and poor air quality, two side effects of our fossil fuel climate crisis. The Inflation Reduction Act delivered billions for green technologies, and we can't ignore one of the old school top tier green technologies, our tree canopy. With fewer trees comes more degrees of heat. Trees fight both climate change and its effects, bringing carbon level temperatures and pollution down. That's why I'm so proud that the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant investment in climate action in history, included $1.5 billion for urban and community forestry. Critical, big. And we've already delivered $22 million of that funding just to Massachusetts for new urban forest and equitable access to green spaces. By investing in urban forestry and protecting our mature trees, we not only combat extreme heat, we also fight flooding, cut noise pollution, purify the air, and provide beautiful spaces for the community. And while we invest in new trees, we can't cut down mature trees because mature trees store more carbon and provide relief from the urban heat island effect. Climate action can't be an either or. It should be a yes and. We need new and old trees, solar panels, and forests, dense housing, and accessible green space. To repurpose Joyce Kilmer's trees, technological solutions like poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. So thank you all for everything you are doing to preserve the tree canopy, which we have, and to expand it to protect the planet.
Thank you. That was very inspiring from Senator Markey, and we're very glad to have his support for trees in general and for the legislation, the wonderful legislation he's been doing. So I want to turn now to our first section of the evening, where we're going to talk about forests. And I want to take just one moment to emphasize the urgency of this. Trees are being cut across the Commonwealth, in state forests, all over the Commonwealth, in watershed areas, in reservoirs, on unceded Wampanoag land. And we do need to do something about this. And we are very fortunate to have with us William Moomaw, who is a climate scientist. We're going to start with the science here. Professor Moomaw is, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Professor Moomaw, and I will continue to introduce you as you do that. Professor Moomaw is a professor emeritus at Tufts and a distinguished visiting scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. His climate science research focuses on natural climate solutions, especially proforestation, a concept he introduced. In 2019, he was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for his contributions to climate science. He has been a lead author of 5 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports, including the 2007 report that shared the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was a member of Governor Healey's 2023 Climate Forestry Committee.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'd like to follow Senator Markey's call for protecting our existing trees and expanding our forests. And I'm going to, I served on Governor Healey's committee on forest and climate change, and I'm going to let you know some things from that, and that'll set the context for my presentation. This photo here is actually in Western Massachusetts. And the little arrow there, it shows you the height of the person you can barely see at the base of that very tall tree. Massachusetts, believe it or not, hosts the tallest trees in all of New England, some of which hold as much as 6 tons of carbon. And the kinds of forests we have these mixed hardwood forests. And in Massachusetts, the average age of those forests is about 70 years. But these are trees, species that can live for 200, 300, some even 400 years. And we have actually found a few of those very old trees. Not in large forest stands, unfortunately, only about 13 or 1,400 acres of Massachusetts 6 million acres can be considered true primary forest, and it's in lots of small patches. And on the left here is a white pine stand, and these trees are more than 150 years old. They're approaching 200 years, and the one you're looking at are among the very tallest of the trees that we have in the state. And last year, the Secretary for Energy and Climate, Rebecca Tepper, appointed 12 people, 12 experts to a committee to create recommendations for climate-oriented forest management guidelines. This is the link to that report. It's a little hard to find on the state website, so I'm putting it here, and it's also in the chat. Who are these dozen experts? Well, 8 of them actually had some connection with the forestry industry, including at schools of forestry. And 4 of us, 2 were climate scientists who work on forest and carbon, and 2 were forest ecologists. And in putting together the report, we realized early on we couldn't get a watered down compromise. So we said, let's let each of the 12 scientists in their respective fields, whether it's forestry or forests, difference there, make their recommendations. So here's some things from the report. It is critical to ensure that Massachusetts forests are conserved and managed to optimize carbon sequestration and mitigate climate harms as part of meeting the state's aggressive climate goals. Those goals are that we will reduce our fossil fuel emissions by 85% by 2050, and we have interim goals, 2030, so 40, and so on. That other 15%, whatever is left, has to be taken out by our forests. Forests as climate solutions will accelerate progress toward our land conservation goals for protecting 30% of the Commonwealth by 2030 and 40% by 2050 in service of achieving net zero statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The goal is also, there's a separate biodiversity goal that setting aside 30 and 40% of the Commonwealth will help protect these vanishing species and protect many species that we don't even know exist. And here are some of the summary findings. The committee generally agreed that passive management confers greater increase in carbon stocks than active management, and that allowing forests to grow and age is typically best to maximize carbon storage. Now, interestingly, that was agreed to by both the forestry experts and the climate and forest ecology experts. The committee strongly agreed that carbon storage is typically greatest in old forests and disproportionately in the largest trees, and that Massachusetts forests can continue to accumulate carbon for many decades if undisturbed. And I'll show you in a moment more detailed proof of that. And the committee also strongly supported efforts to reduce land conversion, meaning clearing forests for other purposes, whether that's for development or roads, transmission lines, which we need, but we can put those where they don't require cutting down forests, solar arrays, other things, development that we want to enlarge our forest reserves. So on the other hand, what we discovered going in is that there are underlying assumptions about forests. Since 400 years ago, when the Europeans, the British arrived, forests have been seen as a renewable natural resource to be harvested. They didn't see it as renewable. That's actually only around 1900 that we realized it could be managed renewably. So in other words, not to just cut and run, but to replace the forest we do cut down. So they could be harvested and regenerated to maximize economic returns. In other words, forests were a natural resource to produce economic returns. And secondly, forests must be cleared for the expansion of towns, farms, industry, and even renewable energy development. Primarily in Massachusetts now, it's solar development. And on the other hand, some of the members of the committee recommended an increase in harvest in order to increase the share of locally produced products. So here's the direct quote from the report. Some recommended that Massachusetts produce more of the wood it consumes and seek to utilize more harvested wood in long-lived products that store carbon and substitute for more emission-intensive materials. So there's a disagreement among the experts. One that is expert in managing forest as a natural resource, and the other managing forest for climate and biodiversity and all the other benefits that forests provide. So this was the argument, and I was on this side of this argument. Our forests are better suited for removing and storing carbon, and those elsewhere should produce wood to meet Massachusetts' needs. Not all forests are the same across the country. And some, particularly in parts of the country, grow much more rapidly and have been pretty much converted into tree farms already. And it's perfectly fine to get our wood from those locations. We don't have to produce it all ourselves. As one person pointed out, you know, we don't produce all the artichokes we eat in Massachusetts either. The committee recommended that at least 10% of the forest in Massachusetts, this is an immediate recommendation, of all ownerships be managed as reserves, and the reserves on state lands be codified to ensure long-term passive management. We have some designated reserves, but they are not in legislation. And we need to do that if we're really going to have them as permanent reserves. Now, state agencies are harvesting forested lands. The Department of Conservation and Recreation is harvesting on Massachusetts state forests. And also in the through the Water Management Agency, they're harvesting in the carbon-dense watershed forests of the Quabbin Reservoir that supplies water for the greater Boston area for all you folks at the other end of the state. I'm out here in Western Massachusetts, by the way, where the forests are, where most of the forests are. And there's also a plan by Mass Wildlife to clear 30% of the lands to provide for, quote, early successional habitat for animals that prefer recently cleared ecosystems. And the good news from the committee was that the report was not favorable to harvesting by each of these agencies to meet climate goals and called for more transparency and purpose in limiting harvests. In other words, neither DCR nor Water Resources has a mandate or even a justification in legislation to be harvesting forest. But because forests are there, they are to be harvested as a renewable natural resource. The problem with Mass Wildlife is there'd be a huge amount of carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere from all those harvests if they've harvested 30% of their land. So the committee was pretty negative on these approaches. And on the other hand, I'm going to say something that will sound a little radical when I first mention it, but hopefully you'll get the point. Here's an alternative perspective. Forests have a planetary role. Forests are vital organs of a living planet. They are essential components of the Earth's operating system. And without forests, we'll see things would be a whole lot worse than they are right now. There's just been a recent study that demonstrates that forests have played the major role in controlling global temperatures and a stable climate throughout the benign, what we call the Holocene epoch that followed the last ice age to the present, and in which all of recorded human history has taken place. We are very fortunate that we've had the climate we have had, or else we would not have the culture and society and so-called civilization that we have today. And just about in the middle of our 6-month approach, one of our members had a paper published called Middle-Aged Forests in the Eastern U.S. Have Significant Climate Mitigation Potential. And this is Richard Birdsey. He's a retired U.S. Forest Service chief scientist. He's the one who got the Forest Service to start counting carbon as they manage their all of our forests, our national forests. And here are just a couple of the short statements that the paper points out. Middle-aged forests in the eastern U.S., which are the kind you can say Massachusetts has mostly, have attained about half their potential carbon stocks. And most eastern U.S. forests could continue to accumulate carbon for many decades or several centuries in the absence of harvesting, with relatively low risk of natural disturbances. That's really important. Our temperate forests in the Northeast United States are probably among the most resilient in North America. They are functioning pretty well, even as the climate is changing, and they're likely to continue that into the future. So in the near term, say the next 20 or 40 years, reducing harvest will yield the greatest reduction in greenhouse gases compared with business as usual, because that's when those trees will start really accelerating their growth. And that growth will, depending on the species, will peak sometime after 100 years. But they really are we're going to need those trees that are growing right now. And so how our forests are managed can clearly affect their contribution to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and beyond. These are all direct statements from this research paper. Now, let me just say something about the benefits that forests have already done for the Earth's climate. Were Earth's forests not accumulating heat-trapping carbon dioxide, the current global atmospheric concentration of 422 parts per million, that means out of every million molecules of air, 422 of them are carbon dioxide. And that's much higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. It was only 280 parts per million at that time. But without trees, without our forests in the world absorbing carbon dioxide every day, that present concentration would have been achieved around 1960. And that would make our concentrations today pretty unbearable. And let me just show you that graphically. This was from something from the so-called Met Office in the UK in 2021. The atmosphere achieved a benchmark of a 50% increase over pre-industrial levels. That's shown on this graph. And the little oscillations are when we actually started measuring it directly in the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide oscillates every year because in the northern hemisphere in particular, trees absorb carbon dioxide in spring, summer, and fall, and they don't in the winter. So there's a little more carbon dioxide in the winter in the northern hemisphere than there is in the summer. So here's what would happen. What would happen if forests were to did not remove 30% of carbon dioxide emissions every year? Well, so here we are with our increase, 417 parts per million. And that's where it would be. It would be almost 400. This was in 2021. That's where it would have been back here in 1960. And here is where we'd be today. That's just unfathomable as a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, there's been a background of research, one of which caught my eye a few years ago. The largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprised 50% of forest biomass worldwide. A group out at Utah State University, and they looked at 48 forests around the world. And what that means is that half of all the carbon in this forest is in the largest 1% of trees. That means all these little trees added up don't have as much as these relatively few big trees. And here's another example. Again, these are both in Massachusetts, and that's Bob Leverett, whom some of you may know, who is a master at having, first of all, discovered where the largest trees are in Massachusetts and the tallest ones. And he's here shown measuring some, and he has done just wonderful work on getting us to understand the importance. And that led me to make the point that we needed to let more forests grow. And I published this paper with two colleagues, Susan Messino and Ed Faison. And growing forests to reach their potential for carbon accumulation, wood and soils in the absence of harvesting, is an alternative to planting. Planting trees is a wonderful thing to do, but little trees don't have much carbon in them. It is the currently growing middle-aged and older forests that are removing all this carbon dioxide. So growing forests to reach their potential for carbon accumulation is the goal. And cutting old trees, we often hear young trees grow faster than old trees. Well, middle age trees grow faster than old trees. Younger trees really don't, if they're really tiny, first 10, 20, 30 years. But if we cut down this big tree and replaced it with younger trees, those trees would never catch up in, let's say, the time. Let's say this tree was harvested, and we planted little trees and looked at them at the age of this tree, which is probably 170 years. In other words, they could never catch up to where this tree is. And yes, it's going to die someday. And you can just see these arrows point to the size of this tree and this tree. That's a little young tree. This is a big old tree. And here's a young forest, and here's an old forest. And that's me standing next to this magnificent, enormous old tree out here in Western Massachusetts. And we looked at this whole question about, do little trees really do better than big trees? And this was with Bob Leverett. We did this study together. And this is a stand at age 50, it had about 38 trees in it, and it had about 45 tons of carbon in that stand of trees. And at 100 years, there were fewer trees, but the amount in the stand was greater. It was up here at 50. So we've gone from maybe a little over 20 to 50. And we only went from 0 to a little over 20 here, and we increased even more in the second 50-year period, and still more in the third 50-year period, even though there were fewer trees. There is natural selection that thins them and so on. So this is just showing that these older forests are not only holding more carbon, they are removing more carbon every year. And to put it in starker terms, again, Bob Leverett put this together. It's really great. This is a 150-year-old big red oak, 100 feet tall, 54 inches in diameter. And so somebody says they're going to cut it down, but don't worry, we're going to plant another tree, or 2 trees, or 3 trees. But how many trees does it take to get the amount of tree you had here? That is the total amount of living biomass and wood, and therefore carbon, because wood is 50% carbon by weight. And it turns out the trees you might plant are these large landscape trees that are 25 feet tall and 4 inches in diameter, 10 years old. It would take 465 of those to equal this one tree that you cut down. Nobody's going to plant 465 trees to replace this one. And this is doing trees here half as tall. You still need 35 of them to equal that one. And carbon emissions from harvesting exceeds the emissions from all other disturbances combined. So here are the numbers. This is from a research paper by the U.S. Forest Service. It's from a few years back, but here the forest harvesting emissions are 162 million metric tons of carbon. And here are all these rainbow of colors. It's insects, fire losses, wind, drought, harvest, conversion. And all that added together is about 15%. And the harvesting is emitting 85%. And we hear a lot about wildfires in the West and so forth, and it makes spectacular television. But it's still, even with the fires we've had, which may actually be more than we see in this figure here, it's still a fraction of what harvesting releases. And here's another source of loss, the clearing of forests for solar arrays. So here is showing a solar array in North Adams, Massachusetts, near me. And it was found in a study by Clark University that 60% of the land cleared for solar energy was forested. And that conversion of forest resulted in emissions of more than 500,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. Again, this study by Harvard Forest and Mass Audubon found that by protecting the most valuable natural and working lands from development, Massachusetts could produce enough solar energy to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals while preserving 76% more forest carbon than our current trajectory. So this is really not a good idea to be cutting down our forests to put in solar panels. So there are all these statements here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on how important this is. And here we have a statement from another organization saying the same thing. The scientist Ed Wilson at Harvard said nature needs half. And so let's create strategic climate and biodiversity reserves and industrial production forests. These two photos were taken about 20 miles apart. So these people are searching for a climate solution. If they look up, a major climate solution is growing in plain sight. That's what vital organs do for a living planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. It's so helpful to have the science to anchor this. I saw some questions in the chat about, is this controversial? And it doesn't seem like it would be, and yet it is debated. I think what Professor Moomaw was referring to about the science of forestry versus the science of forests is part of what we're looking at. But we want to turn now tonight next to a case of deforestation, an actual case of deforestation of what's been going on with the deforestation in the Atlantic coastal pine barrens of southeastern Massachusetts. Meg, if you want to go ahead and get to your title slide, I will introduce both of you. We're fortunate to have with us tonight to present this Linda Coombs, who is a member of the Wampanoag tribe of Aquinnah. She is a historian and museum curator, has been doing that work for nearly 50 years and specializes in the knowledge of the Southern New England tribes. She's previously served as a program director of the Aquinnah Cultural Center, an associate director of the Wampanoag Indigenous Program at Plymouth Plantation, and worked in the Native American program at Boston Children's Hospital. She's the author of Colonization and the Wampanoag Story, which is a book for middle school students. Speaking with her tonight will be Meg Sheehan, who is a public interest environmental lawyer and the coordinator of the Community Land and Water Coalition, which is based in Plymouth. That coalition aims to use civic engagement and the municipal level, at the municipal level in southeastern Mass to protect, preserve, and steward land and water resources. So Linda and Meg, please tell us about the awful losses that are happening now.
My name is Meg Sheehan. I'm with Community Land and Water Coalition. We're a statewide network of groups and individuals. As Melissa said, I will be speaking first, and then we will go to Linda Coombs. So again, I will be talking about a case study defending forests against sand mining and industrial solar. I'll be talking about the forests in southeastern Mass. They're the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag people. Linda will be talking more about that. We have a globally rare pine barrens ecosystem here. Not all of of southeastern Mass is the Pine Barrens, but we are one of 3 on Earth with 200 legally protected species. We have several large land holdings. We have the state's largest state forest, Miles Standish. We have some wildlife management areas, and we also have the state's largest landowner, which is A.D. Makepeace Company. What we're facing is not just normal development here. We're not just facing subdivisions and commercial business parks. We are facing a triple industrial assault of cranberry agriculture, sand mining, and large-scale industrial solar. So to talk about our lands here, we are very low-lying. We have a lot of slow-moving rivers and a lot of wetlands and Atlantic cedar swamp forests surrounding those wetlands. The first industrial assault started in the 1800s with the mining of bog iron from the bogs. Then we went on to dredge, divert, and dike most of our low-lying wetlands and swamps for cranberry agriculture. Then when the Wetlands Protection Act came in the 1970s, all of a sudden we had to build upland bogs, and that has created the situation and the scenario now where the creation of cranberry bogs has led to this ruse that we have to site all these cranberry bogs on top of hills, which leads to our third industrial assault, which is industrial scale commercial mining. So let me talk about for a minute, because I know you're not looking at pictures of trees here, but this was part of a vast swath of upland and pine barrens forests surrounded by rivers. It was a hill of globally rare silica sand. Sand is the second most extracted resource on Earth after water. There's a shortage of this type of sand that is used for concrete and for glass and for any number of consumer products. It's a global issue. The UN is studying it. We have these deposits that are being mined under various ruses. We have lost 2,000 acres over the last 30 or so years to this industrial scale sand mining. Our governor and our state agencies, DEP and the Department of Agriculture, are going along with the ruse that operations like this, an 85-acre sand mine in the town of Carver, which was upland pristine forest. This is what they call cranberry agriculture and just creating bogs. This is part of a 2 square mile area that is being mined, and what is being put on top of some of these instead of the cranberry bogs is industrial scale solar. We've lost about several thousand acres in southeastern Mass to industrial solar, as Dr. Moomaw was discussing. When we talk about trees and smart growth and green development, this is an industrial, so-called innovative business park, a green business park in the town of Carver. This is about 30 acres. It was the highest hill in the town until 2018, when it started to be mined under the ruse of creating a subdivision. You can see the globally rare Pine Barrens forest here. That's about a 200-foot hill. You can see a rare coastal plain pond back here. This is ongoing right now. This is what it looks like today. This is what they're calling a green business park. And I just read their environmental report to DEP, which says this is environmentally sensitive development because they have left this buffer along here. So what are we doing about it? We are educating, we are researching, we have created a movie. We have put out a report called Sand Wars in Cranberry Country, an investigation into the money, politics, and corruption behind sand mining and the silent environmental crisis in southeastern Mass. We're advocating at the local level for enforcement of zoning bylaws and earth removal bylaws, trying to shut down the earth removal entirely. It's a ruse for sand mining. We have hundreds of videos. We've been documenting this for about 3 years now on our YouTube channel, Save the Pine Barrens, Southeastern Mass. And I want to empower you and make you hopeful that we can stop some of this. This is about a 500-acre parcel here, you can see that A.D. Makepeace, who is the world's largest cranberry grower and also the largest landowner in the state and owns about 10,000 acres in southeastern Mass, covered by globally rare pine barrens forests, some of it cranberry bogs, but most of it is forested. They have a 100-year sand plan that they plan to implement, or they are implementing. So they will be clearing out this entire forest for sand, for silica sand, under the rules of cranberry agriculture. So get involved, take action. We have a stop sand mining petition to the governor and to all these local communities. We're also working on responsible solar siting to protect some of our pine barrens forests from solar. There's a Sierra Club outing in May, and it will be a walk and learn. So we hope that people will come to that. You can donate. You can find us on our website, communitylandandwater.org. Thanks. And I'll turn it over to Linda.
Good evening, everyone. Linda Coombs, the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe. I wanted to say that back at the beginning of creation, when Creator made the earth, the animals and the forest, the trees were made before the humans. And when the humans were made, we looked at the trees and the animals as our elders. And the elders in our community are the ones who have the wisdom and the life experience and can teach the younger ones. And those are the roles that we put the trees in. And because we look at them as our relatives, not as something to be harvested and managed, but as relatives, just as I would look at my mother or my cousin or my brother or, my children, relatives. Because each of these things, each tree, each thing in nature, including rocks, has a life. Not only does it have a life, it has a right to its own life. Our cultures were built around that concept. And that is why when the English came here in the 17th century, they described this area as looking like paradise or like Eden. And that was not a random thing. That was a purposefully constructed way of life on our part. So what I'm saying, long and short, is that I think, what I've heard thus far tonight in just the short presentations we've had, and I hear it a lot because I'm involved in this, but is this tug of war with all of these. There are so many organizations involved in trying to, stop, the deforestation or clean up the garbage or, what have you, all of it. And yet, and the huge list that was on the first screen this evening, I mean, it's like all of that is going on, Senator Markey, the whole thing. And yet there's this relentless, almost seemingly unstoppable, thing that Meg was just showing us. What's supposed to be forests, those are relatives, not just mine, but yours, and they're being murdered. And that is our responsibility to stop that. We need a paradigm shift because Indigenous people lived in relationship with the rest of the world, like relations, like relatives, not as some other type of thing, but as living beings with their own right to their life. And I would just ask you to think about that and to learn more about it. Call me, whatever, email me, be glad to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Linda Coombs and Meg Sheehan. We appreciate that. It truly is horrifying to see the destruction. Please, everyone, take advantage of the links put in the chat. There are petitions you can sign that will let the governor and other officials know that you want to see this devastation be stopped. Now, several of the action links that have been in the chat this evening are about state level legislation. And I want to shift now and allow us to hear more about the legislation that's going on in the State House. We're going to hear from State Senator Cindy Creem. She's the senator for the 1st Middlesex and Norfolk District, and she is the Massachusetts Senate Majority Leader and also chairs the Senate Committee on Global Warming and Climate Crisis. She too is a climate champion for us.
Thank you to the Trees as a public good network for hosting today's event and for your continued advocacy supporting legislation that will make our Commonwealth greener. As many of you know, the Commonwealth has committed to combating the adverse effects of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by the year 2050. Achieving this ambitious goal requires multiple strategies, including adopting energy efficiency measures, using renewable thermal energy, installing green infrastructure, and promoting nature-based solutions to strengthen climate resiliency. Forests, both rural and urban, have increasingly been recognized as playing a vital role not only in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but in mitigating such climate extremes as excessive heat and cold, drought, and floods. While climate change affects us all, it does impact some areas and communities more severely than others. Urban and low-income communities are experiencing some of the worst of the climate crisis, which directly relates to the Commonwealth's shrinking down urban tree canopy. For decades, the cities and towns of the Commonwealth have lost thousands of street trees worth millions of dollars from air pollution, drought, neglect, and development. And as the climate change brings heavy heat waves that are more frequent and more intense, these heat disparities could grow worse. That's why the state needs to step in and help municipalities rebuild tree canopies and protect what's left, particularly in disproportionately impacted communities and other areas with low tree cover. This session, I filed an ambitious bill known as the Municipal Reforestation Act, which recognizes that trees are essential infrastructures for climate resilience and environmental justice. The goal of the bill is to achieve 60% tree cover in every Massachusetts city and town. It requires every city and town to develop and implement a detailed municipal reforestation plan. It would provide funding to help cover a wide range of expenses, prioritizing to communities with less than 20% tree cover or high level of pollutants, or sites on environmental justice neighborhoods or heat islands, neediest communities. And it would also create an urban forest advisory council to provide technical assistance and share best practices and procedures. It's an excellent piece of legislation, if I may so myself, that creates a detailed, thoughtful, and collaborative framework for expanding urban tree canopies in Massachusetts. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing to partner with all of you to advance crucial environmental legislation like the Municipal Reforestation Act and other local and statewide efforts to make our Commonwealth greener and support Massachusetts' leadership to green development. Again, thank you for having me.
And thank you to Senator Creem for giving us that thorough and detailed discussion about the importance of the legislation in the legislature right now. Her municipal reforestation bill will indeed help a lot. One of the things, though, that we need to keep in mind is that we have, in shifting to talk about urban trees, that we need to make sure that in addition to planting new ones, because we do need more new trees, that we also think about keeping the ones that we have. Cutting urban trees is, goes on all over the place. This list that I have on the screen of 20 acres here, 4 acres there, 54 trees there, 1,000 trees here, 2,000 trees there. It's happening all over the state. And what we as a Trees as a Public Good Network, we try to provide support for local groups that are trying to prevent these kinds of things. But we're also working with Senator Creem and others for legislation at the state level. There are some links in the chat. We encourage you to sign some of those and to think about this and to think about the issues of what it means to have equity in trees and in what is called green infrastructure. So we're going to shift now and talk to our next research scientist. Zbigniew Grabowski is a research scientist doing interdisciplinary work with IPCC authors. He, in his role as a faculty fellow in the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in New York City. He also teaches at the University of Connecticut through the Extension program. He focuses on water quality, and he's doing very exciting new research on green infrastructure. Dr. Grabowski, if you'd like to go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and to be part of this exciting group, and really resonate with many of the statements and remarks that have been made previous to me, and really acknowledging this and respecting and finding ways forward with our tribal communities and nations throughout our region and beyond is, I think, critical for addressing the complexity of these kind of interwoven challenges we're facing. And thanks for setting me up in terms of thinking about how really trees as living relatives within these cities, which we traditionally think of as the antithesis of nature, are still a vital part of this solution and this conversation. So I hope to spread a little bit of insight into how we can not just think about trees as a vital part of our urban infrastructure and the built environment, but also thinking through some of these deeper systemic relationships between how we conceive of our relationship with nature and the land, and how that can feed into different aspects of design within the urban space, as well as how the urban system is connected to these broader questions of the landscape. To kind of bring home many of the points that were brought up, in various ways by folks we heard tonight, I just want to make it clear that it's very obvious for anyone who's been paying attention to the weather, throughout their lifetimes, but also the kind of assessed data that we have to look at trends. We are already experiencing a much hotter and wetter climate than has been on the historical record. The Northeast in particular is a hotspot for some of those changes. Again, folks are not, this is not going to come as news to many of you, but it's incontrovertible that we're seeing changes in extreme precipitation patterns throughout the region. And these are large changes. These are over 100% increase in observed 5+ inch rain events. So these types of things that we used to think as rare are now becoming normal, and we're entering a new era of sort of climate extremes. And as was brought up previously, the extreme precipitation associated flooding is well recognized. And the kind of general hotter temperatures we're experiencing are also recognized: shorter winter season, less winter precipitation coming down as snow, except for these very large events. But the extremes in temperature are also increasing. So to the point that looking into the kind of lifetimes of our children, we're going to see temperatures that currently don't have a historical analog be more common within our region and throughout the United States, especially the southeastern United States. And those 100-degree and 105-degree plus days, which were quite rare and throughout our region, are now going to become increasingly common. You're looking at in the high end, over a month of extreme temperatures of over 100 degrees in parts of the U.S., and especially creeping up into our cities, which we've historically seen as being climate refuges for folks from down south. And I want to slow down a little bit and kind of zoom out to thinking through, why we're trying to address this question of, added housing density of continued urban development throughout the United States. Traditionally, we think of, development pressure as a function of population growth. I mean, that's, you look at the Club of Rome, you look at most people who kind of talk about the broad, drivers and parameters of this problem is, we have increasing demand for energy and resources. Generally has been driven by changes in population. Throughout the Northeast over the last 20 years or so, we've actually seen populations stay relatively stable. There hasn't been a tremendous growth in our region, and many counties are actually been somewhat steadily declining, obviously with the exception, as you are familiar, in the Commonwealth, in the Boston area, you've had sustained growth throughout southern New Hampshire, parts of southern Maine. But this is really in a regional backdrop of shifting demographics. So when we're talking about, building, increasing housing density and urban development, I think the question is, in New England and the Northeast, how do you do that against a backdrop of uneven population growth and even population decline, especially related to manufacturing decline and various forms of urban disinvestment? Tie this into climate change, and it's obvious that, really the overall human impact in cities on having good environmental quality is exacerbated by climate issues, but really is also fundamentally determined by how we decide how to use land and what types of land use are acceptable and desirable for the people living there, as well as the people who, have influence in land use decisions. Take into account, this kind of heavy modification of drainage systems, legacy infrastructures, and the urban environment really does seem like a complex puzzle of mostly engineered infrastructures that has to be radically evolved in order to not just be climate resilient, but to stop contributing to continued climate change, the acceleration of climate change. And the key question before us is, can the future in these urban areas be both denser and greener? Can it be more livable? Can we meet these shifting demands for housing in a way that's more equitable and actually provides for creates a place where people actually want to live? To me, the answer to this question is yes, but it really does depend on wide land use planning and design practices, of which green infrastructure is kind of a very key concept, I think, in this shifting discourse around urban planning. And that's not just how do we plan for the green elements, the vegetative elements, the living elements of cities, but also think about how the technologies of cities and the technology of urbanism actually depend upon many of those ecological processes and systems and critically shape their function. So when we're talking about what society is trying to get out of, say, living in the city or the town, it's the blend of these technologies and these ecologies that we're looking for, and understanding their relationship, kind of similar to what Linda was urging us how to think about, was what are the relationships between specific technologies, specific framings of the demand for technologies, and the larger kind of living tapestry that we all live within. As one example, the projected increases in energy demand for cooling in future climates that are much hotter can be met through air conditioning systems, obviously, and through intensification of energy demand for those. But they can also be met through integrated planning approaches that restore streams, restore soil moisture, and have evapotranspirative cooling through continuous urban forests and multimodal transit networks that provide, say, cooling corridors throughout the city. Trees obviously provide many more benefits of them. Many of those have been kind of touched on by other folks tonight. But I just want to say that, when we think about the tree, we had a lot of good facts and information on forests. When we think of, the urban environment where you're kind of scaling up from single trees and single small facilities or single small patches, is to think through the personality of each tree and what role it plays in the constellation of relationships, with specific different pollinators, birds, vertebrates, other mammals, as well as the people who call that place home. And in this sense, the tree is not just providing a suite of ecological services, and we don't just think about, living beings as pieces of these technological infrastructure systems, but they're also part of the fabric that actually makes these places feel like home and somewhere where someone wants to be. And that's for humans and non-humans alike. But at the same time, it also does provide these critical ecological services that makes the place desirable. However, the benefits and the functions of these trees are highly contextual. They do require sound urban planning and design practices to actually be realized. Fundamentally, in urban environments that are highly, transformed by human activity, it's the networks of trees, the ecological networks, that often determine many of their ecological functions, but then how people actually, manage, appreciate, allocate resources to take care of them. Those are all critical determinants of the overall health and the function of the urban forest. However, throughout U.S. cities, these benefits are very highly and unevenly distributed. And this has been painfully well documented across hundreds of U.S. cities and towns. I just put up some maps of New York as kind of illustrative of this. But we see very stark segregation patterns throughout U.S. cities, and the kind of see a very strong mirroring of the environmental inequity and the lack of access to different environmental amenities reflected in social hierarchies of race, class, religion, and political and economic influence. So how do you plan for a just urban city in this kind of legacy and ongoing reality of, the structures of settler colonialism, of racist policing, racist real estate investment, and fractured city government. This is an enduring question. We've tried to address this, through a review of the different procedures that are used to transform cities through green infrastructure across the United States. We find that in general, cities have not done a good job of framing their environmental improvement programs around equity principles. Many plans we examined across 20 US cities, only 11% actually define the term equity, only 14% really deal with this idea of justice in a meaningful way. The methods that we have for including communities in decision-making urban planning are often perfunctory. They have manufactured consent through weak engagement mechanisms like token surveys or small public inclusion events. But at the same time, they do plan to significantly transform urban environments. So as cities are kind of grappling with the magnitude of climate change and the magnitude of needing to provide livable services for their residents, they're also really struggling to find meaningful ways of including them in decision-making. So in many ways, the crisis, of climate and the kind of uneven social impacts it has is also a crisis of basic democratic principles and governance within urban areas. The way around that we see as avenue towards through groups like this is to actually really mobilize and enable and empower community groups to build, to be involved and build these transform these planning processes by being genuinely included in them. I think as we make these processes genuinely democratic, they'll need to change to adapt to the different and diverse demands and needs of urban residents. And, the design communities and the people who have been working on this from the kind of architecture, engineering on the technical side have figured out many ways of integrating, both living forms and technological forms for mutual benefit. Just some examples from Germany and Italy, that you can very well imagine a future of urbanism that is both dense and green. In America, the question is, how it can be equitable. One strategy that we've undertaken at the Center for Land Use Education Research at UConn is to really dig into the different zoning tools that municipalities are already empowered to use to make livable built environments that require, harmonizing many different aspects of how we relate to the environment. Because, as a settler, colonial, and technocratic culture, we've tended to silo decision-making along many different, very narrow domains. And the question is, how do they interact with each other? How can we have smart floodplain regulations, protect our source waters, protect groundwaters, protect wetlands and watercourses and their migratory fish populations, conserve open space, design for dense areas where we need to, change the way that people actually are allowed to use, buildable lots to make sure that we're not crossing the wires on different land use regulations at the site which they actually get implemented. And can we move towards, watershed-wide climate responsive thinking when we're talking about stormwater management and volume management alongside water quality management? To me, this really does require a broad intersectoral and interdisciplinary approach. I think this idea of relational ethics that has been, embedded within many different indigenous forms of governance that treats the landscape as a living agroecology, that is kind of the key framework that can be used to guide these principles. For example, in Connecticut, we have on paper a very strong public trust doctrine that requires the state to steward, the air, water, soil, and other natural resources of the state. And yet, over time, we've seen a decision-making system that's been largely permissive of harm. So in many ways, we see a kind of a state failure to, enact its public trust doctrine. And really, it's these deeper ethical engagements with land that need to shape these different types of specific municipal policies. But if you think practically in terms of the key elements that, build living tapestries within cities, these are these preserved large urban agroforest patches connected through the different streetscapes, which ideally are also networks of multimodal paths and urban green stormwater infrastructure, connecting, vibrant urban parks with restored floodplains. So we're not just, dealing with the subsurface drainage system backing up and flooding because it's not designed to handle the precipitation that's now become normal, as well as actually greening roofs and facades of buildings themselves. I think we need to go, slightly larger scale in our thinking as well. And we have lots of precedents to do that throughout the Northeast region. We have many regional conservation organizations I think can be leveraged to think about, and I've got a very active dog off the screen here, so sorry for any background noise. But we have, many folks working to kind of link our protected lands across the region. The question is, can we do that at the fine-grained urban scale as well? And think about how urban communities, how their different energy and land use pathways and regulations actually link to create a regional living tapestry or not. we do have precedents, but I think there's real work to be done to kind of think regionally and act regionally as well as locally. I think one other thing we need to work on is also crossing just these kind of scales and silos in terms of thinking about just the living infrastructure and versus the non-living infrastructure. When we're talking about our larger scale carbon targets, our greenhouse gas reduction, that's really going to come from our intimate relationships with land as sort of agroecological actors. So our agricultural systems really need to be transformed, and those need to link to our transformed manufacturing systems, everything for fiber, building materials, clothing, and the polymers that we've become so dependent on. There's a real potential to kind of shift us towards a biomaterials-based economy, though there will be consequences for how we use land use, and we need to have robust, deliberative decision-making processes to steer this into the future. The emergence of the regional Northeast Biomaterials Collaborative is evidence of this, where we're seeing the notion of carbon drawdown construction really starting to gain traction within adoption within international building codes, as well as the US National Building Code. And I think in the near future, we're going to need to have a very robust conversation around, how do we really start to draw down carbon throughout the collection of, through the relationship between land use systems, built systems, and energy and water systems into the future. I'll leave you on those big picture things for now. Thanks for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you, and I hope they're useful to you all in some way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grabowski. That's very helpful, and it's really, I think, important for us all to realize that there is ongoing research that is looking at how to address these kinds of equity issues. And we can see equity issues in some of what's going on with the cutting of urban trees that I mentioned. This is probably one of the largest, most obvious ones, the cutting of over 20 acres of trees that's planned for the expansion of the private jet airport at Hanscom. There have been links in the chat that can help you address that, and I hope that you will take up that cause. Now we want to turn to our, actually, let me go the other way. We're going to turn to our other case studies. We have 2 case studies for action in the Boston area, both about housing and about how to accommodate other kinds of development with issues of schools. We're going to turn next to Mimi Turchinetz, who is the president of the Hyde Park Neighborhood Association. She is a Boston attorney with a long-term commitment to intersectional analysis around housing, economic, racial, and environmental justice, and she's a founding board member of the Southwest Boston CDC.
Thank you, Melissa. Good evening, everyone. So this is kind of this case study. You can, new slide, please. This case study really looks at the question of drilling down, thinking about all this incredible work that the other presenters have shown us, and then what's going on in local neighborhoods and in the city of Boston. So next slide, please. So I'm speaking about something called the Squares and Streets Initiative, which is specifically about rezoning in the city of Boston. And we'll do some table setting just to start. Specifically, I live in the neighborhood of Hyde Park, and Hyde Park is 9% of the total land in Boston, and it's at the tip of Southwest Boston. Next slide. And the Hyde Park is an extremely green neighborhood, so that we have a lot of trees and a lot of tree canopy. On the other hand, we've lost a significant amount of tree canopy in the past 5 years. So if you see just in terms of this data, we have 14% of the city's tree canopy. 40% of Boston has canopy coverage, and then that's 27% of all of Boston, but we've lost a significant amount over the years. Next slide. So this proposal that is coming out of the city of Boston, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, is called Squares and Streets. And it's specifically to rezone the city. The mayor of Boston, as people may or may not know, ran on a zoning reform platform along with other green strategies, and she is now rezoning the city, and she's using the Squares and Streets initiative to do that. It's a proposed text to the Boston zoning code. The attempt is to create more uniformity, reduce the use of the Zoning Board of Appeal, create more predictability. And for those of you who are in the environmental movement, those words kind of sound the alarm. They sound the alarm to me. Next slide. So what the Squares and Streets, what it's the kind of external marketing goals, and what the BPDA is saying it's going to do is it'll update zoning, it'll preserve and enhance and produce affordable housing, retail, and cultural spaces. It will coordinate local transportation and public space improvements, identify capital and program investments. And then the thing that we're really concerned about here is identify specific design interventions to expand tree coverage, mitigate heat islands, and prepare for not an eclectic future, which I think we all want to have, but it's supposed to be electric future and otherwise advanced climate resilience. But the concern that activists and folks who are paying attention to this is that these protections are not written into the draft zoning text proposed Article 26. Next slide. So what the text amendment does is it creates a floating citywide zoning language to be used across neighborhoods in the city of Boston. So remember, this came directly out of the BPDA. This is not something that bubbled up from the neighborhoods. We didn't say, we need new zoning, we need this new planning, but instead it's top down. It's form-based zoning to be as of right. It will create 6 new zones that will allow for increased height density with no parking requirements, no tree protections whatsoever, no prohibition against clear cutting, no protections from possible negative impacts of heat island creation, no required usable open space, no specific protections for deeply subsidized affordable housing, historic preservation, BIPOC or legacy small business, displacement. And our concern is that the results could be overdevelopment, not be sustainable, and really kind of be a runway for market rate development. Next slide, please. So this is kind of to give you a sense of what the vision of the BPDA, if you will, has. And this is the part of the presentation that they put forward at the Zoning Commission last week, April the 17th, when in fact this language was moved one step forward to codification. So these are 4 of the different zones. There's 6 zones. And if you look at this potential urban square, this is nothing like Hyde Park. That's nothing like a lot of neighborhoods in the city of Boston. It's not clear that this is something that we're interested in having. Hyde Park is a small town in a big city, right? It's not a metropolis. Next slide. So there's people on this call know this. Street trees are protected through state law. Parks and city trees in Boston are protected through a new tree ordinance, which was passed in 2023, but it's just for city trees. And for private trees, there's no protection whatsoever. We are in the process of trying to craft a tree ordinance that will protect private property or private trees, I'm sorry. And part of what happened with the tree ordinance that was just passed is that it was bifurcated. So, now we're back to the drafting table around the issue of private trees. And so we are very, very concerned about what Squares and Streets is going to do in terms of really tree canopy and overdevelopment. Next slide, please. So this, once again, is kind of the vision of what they're looking to do. It's a citywide effort, right? But the 2 neighborhoods that are being proposed to start on with this are Hyde Park and Rosendale. So the 2 sister neighborhoods in Southwest Boston. And the idea is key streets, key squares, and then if you kind of take pinprick in the center of this planning area and go 1/3 all the way around. And so when you saw that the number of how much trees we have in Hyde Park, then you know that there's a lot of trees kind of that development would potentially be gunning for. So a bunch of folks came together. We started to organize Hyde Park, Rosendale, other neighborhood organizations, and a citywide effort. Had meetings to organize, meetings with the mayor, and one of the things that came out of that was crafting our own proposed text to amend the zoning text that was going forward, this new squares and streets text. Next slide, please. So this collaboration of a lot of different neighborhood organizations and leaders came together and created a new proposed text, right? And so the 1 through 8 are kind of the key pieces in what we crafted. Their zoning amendment is over 100 pages. Our proposed amended language is 8 pages. So we wanted to add another transitional zone for less height, density, and unit mix, adding commercial as allowable on the first and second floors, added off-street parking. And I know that this is controversial, right? I mean, we understand that we don't want to be driving cars. On the other hand, Hyde Park doesn't have great public transportation. It has commuter rails, and people are still driving. So until we resolve some of those fundamental issues, people are still going to be driving. And we proposed one going back to 1 parking space per residential unit. Know that that's controversial. I get that. Net zero carbon standards for new construction and adaptive reuse. And then a significant amount of it was around protection and expansion of urban tree canopy, reduction of urban heat islands impacts, and then issues around adaptive use, historic and cultural resources. And then this key thing for us, which is addressing the issue of potential displacement of BIPOC and legacy small businesses. Next slide. So these are just two, in terms of what has happened with that, where we are with that is that the squares and streets proposal got through the BPDA board on a total affirmation vote. We continue to do organizing. The proposal went to the zoning commission on Wednesday last week. It was passed to move forward to get the mayor to sign it, so that we're still organizing around that. These are just two pictures here, a proposal, a development proposal that on the left, full of code violations or zoning variance needs. And then here on the right, these are the amount of trees that would be cut down if this project goes forward. No tree mitigation, no protection of those trees at all. Just important to know that the direct abutter is suing the developer. Next slide. And then this is another gorgeous, beautiful big tree that could be in the path of cutting down our family, right? Next slide. So our goal is really to continue to organize around this. We wanted, if we don't get language in the zoning text, we will continue to organize, maybe work on, we're going to be presenting our language to the zoning commission. We're presenting the language again to the mayor, moving forward in all the avenues that we can to address these things. And, we welcome anybody's participation in this. I saw a bunch of Boston folks, Ward 4 and Ward 5 and Ward 19. Please come forward and start organizing around this with us. We're having a big community meeting in 2 weeks. I'll make sure I get that stuff to Trees as a Public Good. And thank you all, and moving forward to continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's an important consideration, and we should say that it doesn't just affect Boston. What Mimi Turchinetz was talking about is all in the city of Boston, but similar issues are playing out across Massachusetts. Every place that the MBTA Communities Act affects, local towns are having to deal with zoning for more housing, and we need housing and trees. So we need to have space for trees on those lots. So I want to switch now to our last case study of the evening. It's a really important one. This is talking about what happens in an environmental justice community when trees are threatened. And we're going to have that case presented to us by Aalana Feaster. She has 20 years experience as a finance and risk management director. She's a community advocate who has been working to save the Morton Street tree canopy, and she organized an environmental action summit for her community. She's a member of the Beta Gamma Sigma Honor Society, and we're really lucky to have her here tonight to talk to us about what's going on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa. Again, my name is Aalana Feaster. I am a Dorchester resident. I represent the Environmental Health as Wealth Advocacy Coalition, and I'm a member of the Morton Street 10 Residents Group. I would like to thank Trees as a Public Good for hosting such an informative event tonight and for giving us time and space to address these very important environmental issues. My allies and I have been fighting tirelessly against the city, state, elected officials, and developers to prevent the clear cutting of 4 acres of mature canopy in Dorchester, an environmental justice community located in the city of Boston. Our green spaces are under threat, and through my advocacy journey, I found that there's a lot of lip service about what our city and state government plans to do to protect our communities. There are countless PowerPoint presentations, creations of boards and departments within our city and state government with the charge of protecting environmental justice communities and righting the environmental wrongs. But unfortunately, the intentional action steps, regulations, and enforcement that are necessary to prevent these generational environmental harms are not being implemented. As we have heard from the previous amazing panelists tonight, our natural landscapes, including wetlands and green spaces, are vital to our communities. They provide ecosystem benefits such as water filtration, wildlife habitat, and pollution sequestration. These benefits are essential in environmental justice communities that for years have been overburdened by pollution, heat islands, and loss of tree canopy. Our community needs to maintain and protect our mature tree canopy, our communal lungs, to help mitigate future climate change impacts. The fight should not be this hard if the process truly worked. And as I will outline tonight, the process and policies that should be protecting our community and our environment are extremely flawed. And if we do not continue our fight to right these wrongs, our communities will suffer for generations to come. So my advocacy journey began in 2020 when, as a direct abutter to the 4-acre site that I'm going to talk about tonight, I realized the place where I decided to call home and raise my son was going to be destroyed in perpetuity. So this is a picture of the Morton Street site that I'm going to be speaking about tonight. Next slide, please. And so this is an aerial view of the Morton Street site, showing that there are homes that, are right along this 4-acre site that is slated for potential destruction. Next slide, please. And this is just giving you just on the map, it's in Suffolk County, just for a point of reference. Next slide. And just another map view, just so you to understand the location of this Morton Street site. Next slide. So here we're just showing that the Canterbury Brook environmental justice ecosystem, there's the stream, wooded uplands, open fields, and it just shows the connection of the ecosystem around and through this 4-acre site and how valuable it is to our community. Next slide, please. And just giving another ground level view of what people see as they're traveling along Morton Street today. Next slide. And we can just bypass, I was in there twice, just wanted you to take it all in. But this here is also Morton Street. So this is the same street after the tree canopy without any trees, and it looks lifeless and barren. So this is why we are really trying to advocate for the protection of the 4-acre site. Next slide, please. So 4 acres of the mature, beautiful tree canopy that we just saw in the pictures will be destroyed for the installation, potentially destroyed for the installation of an artificial turf field. This proposal will create an enormous heat island equivalent in size to 4 football fields and an environmental justice community in perpetuity. The community was not given a seat at the table to discuss a proposal that would benefit the entire community, not just a small portion. And regulations do not protect resources in EJ communities. This proposal will expose the community to harmful particulate matter from PFAS forever chemicals found in artificial turf. And exposure to PFAS can cause the following illnesses: testicular cancer, kidney cancer, liver damage, exacerbate asthma, and other respiratory illnesses. Next slide, please. So the developer has not conducted any studies to assess the damage or impacts to the environment from the significant tree loss, the increase of traffic on heavily traveled Morton Street, increased air pollution for the community. The tree canopy is a natural carbon sequestering benefit. It helps to reduce pollution from the Morton Street traffic, St. Michael's crematorium, and particulate matter from a turf field that was just recently installed at the Brook Charter School. We're talking about contamination of the Canterbury Brook, displacing and poisoning wildlife, flooding that may occur due to the removal of trees that are currently capturing and storing stormwater runoff, and the habitability and quality of life for residents whose property abuts this site. Next slide, please. City and state agencies have failed to protect natural resources in EJ communities. We have contacted numerous state agencies and city departments, and this is just a synopsis of the departments that have failed us thus far. So we have DCAM, the Division of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance. DCAM is the state agency that owned the 4-acre site and conveyed the land without proper community input to the developer. We have the MEPA office, Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act office. And the MEPA statute indicates that the agency is charged with, among other things, the following: Chapter 30, Section 61. All agencies, departments, boards, commissions, and authorities of the Commonwealth shall review, evaluate, and determine the impact of the natural environment. Determine the impact on the natural environment of all works, projects, or activities conducted by them to minimize environmental damage. So because this property that we're talking about was on state land, we figured that a MEPA review and the harm that it would cause, a MEPA review would be required. June 2022, our community requested an advisory opinion as to whether a MEPA review was required for this project due to the environmental harm that it would cause. September 22 of that same year, the MEPA director ruled that a MEPA review was not required. So next slide, please. So in January of 2023, through our council, we filed a fail-safe petition as a 10 residents group challenging the aforementioned ruling. March of that year, the MEPA director, who also reviewed the advisory opinion, again denied our appeal and indicated that even under this scenario, a MEPA review still was not required. Boston Conservation Commission, March 2023, despite receiving numerous letters of opposition and comments from scientists and concerned community members, the Conservation Commission approved this toxic turf field installation right by the wetlands, the Canterbury Brook, and residents' homes. Our 10 residents group is in the process of appealing the Conservation Commission's decision to Mass DEP. Next slide, please. So there are realistic alternative natural grass sites where this proposed athletic field can be installed. Harambe Park is 45 acres, very close to the school. Franklin Park, right across from the school. They have the White Stadium proposal and a number of playing fields where this site could be located and utilized for, this athletic field that the school wants. And the city needs to work to improve the existing neighborhood parks before allowing for the destruction of our urban forest areas. So while residents have the option of continued administrative review with Mass DEP, City of Boston Parks Commission, and ultimately court, we would prefer a cooperative approach which provides the spaces that the students need to play, but also provides the open space protections that we need in our community. Next slide, please. So this is just showing with the urban forest plan, they're talking about the canopy goal is 40%. Morton Street area, we're already at a deficit, only having 21% of canopy, and we're talking about trending in the wrong direction by allowing, if this project is allowed to move forward, moving away from the target goal of increasing the canopy in an environmental justice community. Next slide, please. So ways to get involved in the grassroots effort, we do have a petition that you can sign. We have 1,700 signatures, and it's growing to show your support to hopefully get this in front of the decision makers for them to understand we are looking for the preservation of this green space. You can always email me if you want to send letters of support at savemortonstreettrees@gmail.com. And then also please take the time, if you have it, to watch the Environmental Action Summit that we hosted with a lot of other community activists to not only talk about the Morton Street site, but other sites within the city of Boston where these same issues are impacting the green spaces. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, natural sites like Morton Street and Dorchester do not have adequate protections. There's a gap between stated commitments to environmental justice and actual actions such as strengthening rules and regulations. Projects have to be reviewed through an environmental lens, and the city and state should prioritize developing sites that do not require clear-cutting mature trees. Examples of regulations that, if passed or strengthened, can help protect canopy. In the city of Boston, the Conservation Commission Climate, EJ, and Inland Waterway regulations, which right now today are 3 years past due. So we're saying that there's no sense of urgency to protect our natural resources. The private tree ordinance, we need a very strong private tree ordinance. And as Mimi talked about before, and it needs to be included with tree protection in squares and streets. And as far as MEPA at the state level, the MEPA thresholds are far too high for MEPA review in EJ communities. Mass DEP needs to perform cumulative impact analysis for resources in EJ communities. And there needs to be a statewide ban on artificial turf and PFAS. We don't want any PFAS in our communities, and we want our green spaces protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is horrifying to hear about and so important to hear about. There's a link in the chat to the petition to save the Morton Street trees. I encourage you to take the link and sign it. And I want to, as we wrap up for this evening, I want us to think about and realize that taking action is what makes officials, both elected and appointed, pay attention and act. So we do need you to email, to phone, to go to standouts. And we will send a follow-up email with all the action links from today's forum. We hope you will use those, but we're also asking you to do something a little harder conceptually, which is to start thinking differently about trees. We have to stop thinking about trees as something that any one person owns. As a number of speakers have talked about, trees are living beings and need to be appreciated for themselves. And trees also provide eco-services so that we have to understand them as like air and water. Human beings cannot live without them. So we hope that you will take the actions that we've put into the chat. There is an in-person action tomorrow for Earth Day. Extinction Rebellion Boston is having a party for the planet in Love and Rage at 4 p.m. tomorrow in Christopher Columbus Waterfront Park. I hope if you are going to be in or near Boston tomorrow, you will take the opportunity to go there. And I want to close by thanking all of our co-sponsors, many of the people who represent these different organizations are doing a lot of the hard work, and we appreciate their help in spreading this news. We appreciate the Democratic committees of 20-some different parts of the Commonwealth. We are all trying to make a greener future. We hope that you will join the Trees as a Public Good Network. There's a link in the chat for how to do that and help all of us to make a greener future. Thank you all very much and good night.